He called her weak in front of the squad. She was their original trainer. You look a little lost, sweetheart. PT's that direction. Or did they assign you here to hand out water bottles for the real soldiers? The words cut through the training bay like a blade scraping the flat of a steel plate. Slow, deliberate, meant to draw blood without leaving a mark. Captain Derek Holt didn't lower his voice when he said it. He never did. That was the point. He stood at the center of the 3rd Special Operations Group Field Training Facility at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Chest ribbons catching the fluorescent light overhead. Arms crossed like a man who owned not just this base, but the entire eastern seaboard. Behind him, 41 soldiers stood in a loose horseshoe. Operators, instructors, logistics staff. 3 junior officers with clipboards who hadn't yet learned that watching a man perform cruelty was the same as applauding it. The air inside the bay smelled of rubber matting and gun oil, and the particular kind of sweat that comes from men who have been training hard for 6 hours and know the day is not finished. The AC unit near the north wall hummed at a frequency that bordered on pain. Outside, October rain struck the tarmac in sheets. Inside, 41 people waited to see what the woman at the equipment table was going to do. She was 31 years old. 5'6", lean in the way that suggested utility rather than aesthetics, the kind of lean that comes from carrying weight over distance rather than lifting it for sport. Her uniform was clean, pressed, regulation. No rank insignia on the collar. No unit patch on the shoulder. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun at the base of her skull with military precision. Not approximately military, exactly military. Every strand accounted for. She was currently reassembling a disassembled M110 sniper rifle, and she had not looked up when he spoke. She did not look up now. Her hands continued moving, right hand on the upper receiver, left aligning the barrel assembly with the particular grip of someone whose wrists understood the geometry before the brain had to ask. The angle of her fingers. The pressure distribution. These were things you could not fake with a manual. These were things that came from years of doing the same motion in the dark, in the rain, in the kind of cold that made metal stick to skin. She controlled her breathing. 4 counts in, hold 4. 4 counts out, hold 4. The rhythm was so internal and so complete that a man watching closely might have thought she simply wasn't breathing at all. Captain Holt took a step closer. His boots crunched on the rubber matting. His shadow fell across the equipment table, across her hands, across the rifle components arranged with the kind of order that implied a personal system. She finally looked up. "Higher than yours, sir," she said. "You just don't know it yet." Then she looked back down at the rifle. The kind of silence that followed was the kind that makes people glance at exits. Someone near the back of the horseshoe exhaled through their nose. A boot scuffed the floor. 41 people held very still, the way people hold still when they are watching something they are not sure is safe to acknowledge. Captain Holt's jaw tightened. He was not a man accustomed to this particular variety of response. He had anticipated anger, or embarrassment, or the specific flustered silence of someone caught without a script. What he had not anticipated was a woman who answered him in 8 words and went back to work as though he had asked her to pass the salt. He decided she was arrogant. An inflated opinion of herself, probably. The kind of inflated opinion that comes from being praised too often in environments that had never truly tested her. He had seen it before. He would enjoy correcting it. Near the east wall, half obscured by a rack of tactical vests, a man stood watching. He was 61 years old, with 34 years of service written into the lines around his eyes and the way he held his coffee cup, not casually, but with the specific controlled economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. His name was Command Sergeant Major Leonard Birch, and he had been watching the woman at the equipment table since she arrived at 0600, 3 hours before anyone else. He watched her hands. He had watched them complete the authentication cycle on the communications terminal in 9 seconds. He had watched the muscles in her forearms engage when she lifted the rifle casing in a way that required no thought. He had watched her sit through 6 hours of Holt's increasingly theatrical domination exercises with the absolute stillness of someone who had been still in much worse situations, in much darker places, for much longer. His pen had stopped moving 10 minutes ago. He said nothing. He watched. By noon, the story had already traveled through 3 unofficial channels. Holt had told it at the 0830 debrief, and the version that came back to him at lunch had evolved into something that made her sound simultaneously pathetic and delusional. That consultant woman. The one who thinks she's qualified to train SOG operators. She introduced herself as a trainer. Can you imagine? The mess hall laughter was the kind that invites everyone else to join in. She ate alone at a table near the window where the rain was still hitting glass. Her tray held institutional food that she consumed with the methodical efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that meals were fuel, not comfort. She was listening, not visibly. She gave every appearance of staring at the middle distance while she ate, but she was tracking the patterns of the room. Who sat where? Who deferred to whom? Where the real information moved, and by what means. The formal briefing at 0800 had given her the organizational chart. The mess hall at noon was giving her the truth. Holt ran this unit through performance, not mission. Performance. The exhibition of authority as its own end. The management of perception at the cost of actual readiness. She had seen it before. She had been briefed on it. The 2 deaths in the Mosul rotation 18 months ago ruled equipment failure, had not been equipment failure. She filed the pattern away. At 1400, she was reassigned from the equipment bay to assist with field navigation training for the junior operators, a move designed to be demeaning, positioning her alongside trainees who had been in uniform for under 6 months. Holt announced it to a room of 17 senior operators with a small smile that said exactly what it was meant to say. She said nothing. She walked to the field. She watched a 22-year-old operator named Torres struggle with the compass bearing for the 4th consecutive attempt. She stood beside him. She said nothing for 30 seconds. Then she said, "Magnetic declination. Adjust 7 degrees." Torres adjusted. The bearing aligned immediately. She moved on. Sergeant Major Birch was observing from the tree line, clipboard in hand, recording training performance data. He wrote nothing in that moment. He was watching her move down the line of junior operators, the way she covered ground, the way she assessed each man's technique without announcing her assessment. The particular economy of motion that does not come from a manual, the kind of economy that comes from having moved through environments where an extra step could be the last one. He added it to the picture he was building. By 1600, the pattern had a name. Holt had not simply mocked her, he was building an official case. A credential irregularity, he said. An access anomaly, he told his aide. Her clearance documentation, submitted through standard channels, had triggered an automatic review flag. He intended to pursue it. He had, in fact, already filed the paperwork to have her credentials suspended pending investigation. She received notification at 1617 via her terminal. She read it once. Put the terminal down. Then she controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out. hold 4, and picked up the equipment she had been servicing. At 1800, during a close quarters tactics review, a lieutenant named Marsh challenged her to demonstrate a disarmament sequence, the kind of challenge that is framed as collegial, but is designed to fail. She was smaller than the demonstrating partner by 4 inches and 40 pounds, a disproportion that the room noticed loudly. She disarmed the demonstrating partner in 3 seconds. Not aggressively, just finished. The room went into a kind of stunned calibration, the mental adjustment of men who have just watched their reference points shift without warning. Marsh recovered first, calling it a fluke, saying the partner had telegraphed. She did not respond. She set the training weapon down and returned to her position. In the tree line, Sergeant Major Birch's face cycled through 2 things: recognition, then something else, and settled into an expression no one present would have been able to read. His pen had stopped moving again. He was looking at the way she had gripped the training weapon during the disarmament, the angle of her right wrist, the placement of her thumb. Rangemaster Protocol. The specific placement they teach at a school whose name does not appear in standard training documentation. He had been at that school 14 years ago. His jaw tightened. At 1830, Holt escalated. He convened a formal security review board, himself as presiding officer, with 4 witnesses from his staff. She was escorted to a conference room on the base's administrative level and informed that her access credentials were suspended, her communications privileges were restricted, and her movements were to be limited to designated areas pending investigation. She was informed that this process could take up to 72 hours. She sat across the table from Holt, her hands flat on the surface, her posture so precisely regulation that it required a second look to confirm it was not performed. His aide read the formal complaint. She listened. She answered each question with exactly the words the question required. Full name and current assignment: Maya Reyes. Staff Consultant. Readiness Assessment Program. Who authorized your base access? Standard RAP processing. Flag Officer authorization on file. Authorizing officer's name? Available through official channel request. Holt smiled at that. He had made 4 requests through official channels. Each one had returned a routing message. He assumed obstruction. He had not yet considered the alternative. She had not corrected him. She controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out, hold 4. This is the near-fail moment. The point where anyone watching from the outside would think she's finished. Caught, game over. Except games have rules, and she was about to show them they had been playing the wrong game entirely. Outside the window, it was full dark. The rain had stopped. The base was settling into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere in the east wing, a door closed. They held her in a temporary detention room on the administrative level, a room that was officially a waiting area, but was being used as a holding space. Concrete walls. Metal bench. A narrow window near the ceiling that framed a rectangle of cloud and sodium light. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and something older beneath it. The specific institutional smell of rooms where people wait against their will. She sat on the bench and looked at her watch. The face read 21:47. In 23 minutes, at 22:10, Colonel James Whitfield, who commanded the Special Operations Readiness Oversight Division from his office in Alexandria, would receive an automatic notification that her biometric check-in had not registered as scheduled. He would attempt to reach her through 2 channels. Both were currently restricted. In 63 minutes, at 22:50, a protocol she had initialized 6 weeks ago would activate automatically through systems that did not run through this base's administration. The protocol would contact 3 offices simultaneously, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Joint Special Operations Command Duty Officer, and a specific classified directorate whose name was not on any public organizational chart. In approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, Captain Derek Holt was going to learn the difference between institutional rank and classified authority. Her watch did not leave her wrist. Nobody had thought to take it. She had counted on that. She had planned on that 3 months ago, the week she was briefed on the assignment. She controlled her breathing. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out, hold 4. She waited. The first crack appeared at 22:04. Sergeant Major Leonard Birch knocked on the door of the duty officer's room, entered without waiting for a response, and said 6 words to the young captain behind the desk. "I would not touch this one." The duty officer, Captain Reeves, looked up from the administrative report he was completing. "Sergeant Major?" "The woman they brought in tonight, Reyes." Birch's voice was quiet, not dramatic. The kind of quiet that men who have spent 3 decades making important things happen quietly default to. "I've seen that grip before. That range posture. I'd be very careful about what this installation is processing tonight." Reeves looked at him. "Captain Holt has authorized." "I heard what he authorized." Birch looked at something on the wall behind Reeves, not the wall itself, something past it. "Make sure your paperwork is exact. That's all I'm telling you." He left. Reeves sat with that for 45 seconds, then opened a second screen and began reviewing the access restriction documentation Holt had filed. At 22:47, the call came. Not to Holt. To the base commander's office, directly, on a secure line, from a number that the communications sergeant on duty did not recognize, and then recognized all at once in the way that makes a person go entirely still. By 22:55, 3 vehicles had pulled through the main gate. Not standard transport. Command birds, 2 black Suburbans with federal plates and a 3rd vehicle with no plates at all. They moved through the base at pace. At 23:01, Colonel James Whitfield entered through the eastern administrative door with 4 people beside him, 2 in JSOC service dress, 1 in a suit that had the particular quality of federal authority, and 1 woman in her 50s in full Army dress uniform whose rank insignia made the duty officer in the corridor step back and place himself against the wall without being told. Holt was retrieved from his quarters at 23:03. He arrived in the administrative corridor in his service uniform. He had taken time to dress, which said something about him, and found 7 people standing in the area outside the detention room. Whitfield he recognized. The shock officers he recognized by type. The federal agent he filed away. The general he did not recognize for 2 full seconds. Then he did. Then his face did something it rarely did. It went quiet. Not theatrical quiet, actually quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a man reassesses the entire sequence of decisions that have brought him to a specific location at a specific moment. Whitfield said, "Open the room." They opened the room. Maya Reyes stood from the bench when the door opened. She did not look at Holt. She looked at Whitfield and gave the kind of nod that passes between 2 people who share a context no one else in the room has access to. She smoothed the front of her uniform with both hands. She looked at her watch. The face read 23:08. 2 minutes late, she said. "You hit traffic." "Route 66, Whitfield said. "I know." She finally looked at Holt. "Captain." He said nothing. His hands were at his sides. The general in dress uniform stepped into the corridor light, and for the first time the full rank insignia was visible. And the man nearest to Holt, a senior NCO named Petty, who had been with Holt for 2 years, made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word and stepped to the side. The general said, I need to see her. He moved past Holt. He stood in front of Maya Reyes, and his eyes went to her left forearm. The sleeve had ridden up slightly when she smoothed her uniform, and he saw the tattoo. He went rigid. Not dramatic, not theatrical. The kind of rigidity that happens in a man's spine when his nervous system receives information that overrides everything else. The tattoo was 3 inches by 2 inches, positioned on the interior of the left forearm. A trident insignia, the specific variant used by a classified SEAL unit whose designation had been removed from public records in 2019. Not the standard trident, the other one. The one with the 7-pointed star above the crown. The one they gave to 11 people over 8 years. The general's hand drifted toward his service cover, then stopped, then moved deliberately to his brow. He saluted. The room detonated. Gasps, actual audible gasps, from personnel in the corridor. Someone dropped a tablet. The clatter echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot, sharp and total, and then the silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, physical, a substance with weight that pressed against every person present. The AC unit in the corridor ran loud enough to be felt in the chest. A boot scraped tile. A badge lanyard swung against a doorframe. Whitfield's hand moved to his brow. The 2 JSOC officers saluted simultaneously. The federal agent, who was not military and was under no obligation, looked at Maya Reyes for 3 seconds with an expression of something that was not quite reverence and not quite fear. And then he nodded, slowly, the kind of nod that constitutes its own category of respect. In the corridor, Sergeant Major Leonard Birch stood where he had positioned himself at 2302, against the east wall, coffee cup still in his left hand, as though he had been there long enough to become part of the structure. His eyes were on her. They had been on her since the door opened. His face held an expression that no one present would have called surprise. He raised his right hand to his brow, not because he had to, because he had known, from the moment she gripped that M1 Tain on the equipment table, from the moment she controlled her breathing in 9-second intervals while a man performed cruelty at her, from the moment she adjusted Taurus's compass, bearing with 4 words. He had known, and he had waited, and now he chose. The salute was the choice, not the command. Whitfield spoke for the record, in front of everyone. Commander Maya Reyes, SEAL Unit Classification Omega, current designation, Classified Deep Cover Operative, Defense Intelligence Agency Special Attachment, Security Clearance, above Top Secret Cosmic Rainbow. The mission she is running is above the clearance level of every person in this building, including myself. He looked at Holt. Every person in this corridor, including every flag officer present, answers to her operational authority for the duration of her assignment. He paused. Captain Holt, you detained her. You restricted her credentials. You attempted to file an obstruction complaint through official channels against an operative whose authorization runs through offices that precede your entire career. Whitfield's voice was not raised. That made it worse. The investigation you triggered tonight will now proceed against you. Holt's face cycled through surprise and then a species of denial that was too slow and too private to be performed. And then something that looked, in the corridor light, like genuine fear. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The investigation he had launched, the credential review, the security flag, the detention, had become the mechanism of his own exposure. He had pulled on every available thread, and every thread had led back to him. He went quiet. Not theatrical, Just gone. The federal agent produced a document from the inside pocket of his jacket. He offered it to the senior NCO nearest Holt and said 2 words. The NCO looked at the document and then at Holt, and then placed his hand on Holt's arm with a specific controlled pressure of formal restraint. There were no raised voices, no drama. Institutional justice does not need theater. It only needs authority and paperwork, and tonight it had both in extraordinary measure. Maya Reyes watched Holt leave the corridor and did not move until the sound of his boots had rounded the far corner. She looked at her watch. 23:23. She controlled her breathing. 4 in. 4 hold. 4 out. 4 hold. Then she turned to Sergeant Major Birch. He was looking at her steadily, coffee cup in his left hand. Nothing in his expression that required interpretation. The Mosul rotation, she said. 18 months ago. 2 deaths. Equipment failure ruling. He nodded once. Not equipment failure. No, he said. Not equipment failure. Then you already knew why I was here. I suspected, he said, after the compass work. I knew after the disarmament, and I was certain. He glanced at her left forearm after that. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't say anything for 16 hours. You didn't need me to. That was the longest conversation Sergeant Major Birch had in a month. He meant every word of it. She left the facility at 0400 the next morning, before the base had fully committed to waking. The compound's exterior lights were still in their nighttime orange phase. The tarmac from last night's rain was damp and reflective, the yellow lane markings floating in the puddles like displaced signals from somewhere quieter. She sat for 20 minutes on a low concrete barrier at the east perimeter, facing the direction of dawn that had not yet arrived, her watch face reading 0411. The sky behind the tree line was the specific dark that is not quite night but refuses to admit morning, a held state, a long breath between things. They had called her weak in front of 41 people. They had laughed. They had believed the uniform with no insignia was a confession of insignificance rather than a deliberate tool. They had mistaken the absence of visible authority for the absence of authority itself. It had cost them everything, and it had cost her nothing except 16 hours and a night on a metal bench. She did not feel triumphant. She felt operational. The work was not finished. Holt was in custody. The 2 senior NCOs implicated in the Mosul intelligence leak were being processed through separate channels. The financial trail from the equipment procurement irregularities had been handed to the DIA forensic team, who would follow it where it went. It would go far. She already knew how far. But there was a name on the list that had no face attached to it yet. In the surveillance footage from the Mosul safe house, footage pulled from a server that officially did not exist, through a warrant that was classified above the clearance of the judge who signed it, there was a figure in the background of 3 separate frames. A man. Civilian clothing. Standing on a rooftop across the street from the safe house, 1 hour before the breach that killed 2 operators whose deaths had been ruled equipment failure and whose families had been told nothing that was true. The figure's face was obscured in all 3 frames. Deliberate obscuring, angle and position maintained across multiple appearances. Someone who knew cameras. The figure wore a watch on his right wrist. She had enhanced the frames herself. The watch was a specific model, a Suunto tactical dive model, issued to a very small number of personnel in a very specific program, the kind of program that had a 7-pointed star in its insignia. She looked at her own watch. Justice isn't loud, it's patient. Tomorrow brought new ghosts to hunt. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to MVP Stories for more.